Xin chào quý vị, tôi rất tiếc không được tham dự cuộc họp hôm nay và tôi chỉ có thể đóng góp với một chút thông tin về vai trò nước Pháp trong 3 sự việc liên quan đến Hiệp định Geneva và di cư vào miền Nam. Thứ nhất, Pháp đã bắt đầu rút quân trước khi hiệp định được ký kết tại Geneva. Trong khi mọi người vẫn đang thỏa thuận, trong khi mọi người chưa có giải pháp rõ ràng, Pháp lúc đó không có ý định ra khỏi miền Bắc và chỉ có mục đích bảo vệ con đường từ Hà Nội ra Hải Phòng. Nhưng để bảo vệ con đường ấy thì Pháp ra lệnh thoát ra khỏi các địa phận Bùi Chu và Phát Diệm trong cuối tháng 6. Các đội quân nhân phải đóng góp việc giữ chắc con đường giữa Hà Nội và Hải Phòng, trong khi người dân phải di tản đến Hà Nội. Việc đó đã chứng minh rằng cho mọi người, trong khi vẫn đang thỏa thuận ở Geneva, việc chia đôi đất nước có thể có kết quả nào. Thứ hai, mọi người đều biết trong cả lịch sử Việt Nam Cộng Hòa, có nhiều nhà lãnh đạo, quân nhân, nhà báo và nhà văn nói đến việc Bắc tiến, tức là việc quay trở về miền Bắc. Nhưng cái logic đó, cái ý kiến mà việc thoát đi không chỉ là đi mà có nghĩa là sẽ quay trở về đã bắt đầu từ trước khi hiệp định Geneva được ký kết, khi Pháp rút ra khỏi các địa phận đó. Bởi vì sao? Vì cuộc vận động tuyên truyền của Pháp và quốc gia Việt Nam đã nhấn mạnh ra khỏi miền Nam, đồng bằng sông Hồng không phải là đầu hàng, nhưng chỉ là một cách để tiếp tục chiến tranh trong tương lai. Chỉ là một bước ngoặt, một cách để tiếp tục chiến tranh trong tương lai. Thứ ba, mọi người đều biết việc di cư vào Nam rất lộn xộn và phức tạp, vì bất ngờ và vì chính quyền địa phương của Việt Nam Dân Chủ Cộng Hòa không muốn phát giấy thông hành. Nhưng Pháp cũng có trách nhiệm trong việc đó. Pháp ưu tiên hàng đầu việc tháo gỡ và vận chuyển trang bị vào Nam. Và vì vậy, người dân địa phương hay phản đối việc đó và Pháp phải chống lại việc đó bằng cách là ra lệnh giữ nhiệm và hạn chế người đi lại. Vì ba lý do đó thì So these were the main three ideas summarized in Vietnamese. I'll switch and give the paper in full in French. In English actually. In this paper, I'm underscoring the role of France in three respects. First, in deciding a partition during the negotiations. Second, in creating a narrative of the evacuation. Third, in making the evacuation even more chaotic and complicated than it was initially supposed to be. First, it is important to note that the partition was really not an obvious solution at the beginning of the Geneva Conference. The conference could have dealt with two issues: the ongoing war, opposing the People's Army to the French Union forces, and it was therefore supposed to find a military solution. But there was also a political issue, as you know, the competition opposing two states, the DRV and the state of Vietnam, to rule over the country. And this demanded a political solution. Dealing with this political issue would require a lengthy process because neither the DRV nor the state of Vietnam held contiguous territories. As you can see on this map, the orange color shows the territory that was then held by the DRV, first in 1950, and then the lighter color shows that the territory that was gained in 1954, whereas the area in green shows the territory under the control of French Union forces. And although with respect to Vietnam it looks like a much smaller area, when you look at the population density, which is the map right behind me, then obviously it appears that these are the areas where the population is most densely packed. And in this situation, the most obvious solution was to organize elections to create a coalition government. But this would have required a very lengthy, complicated and tricky process. And as you know, the Geneva Conference opened the discussion on Indochina just the day after the PAVN inflicted a humiliating defeat to French Union forces at Dien Bien Phu. So Paris, after facing that defeat, had won priority that was imposed to everyone. It was to ignore the political process. It was to ignore the need to find a political solution and to prioritize instead the need to have a very swift and speedy ceasefire so that the French Expeditionary Corps could withdraw safely from the zones that were held by the DRV. The other way the French shaped the ceasefire was by making a strategic decision. And in fact, what they did is that they faced sustained attacks from the DRV, and they decided to protect a little bit better the corridor between Hanoi and Haifa. On June 24, without telling anyone, and while everyone was still negotiating in Geneva, they decided to withdraw from the southern part of the Red River Delta, mainly the diocese of Fatzim and Boutou, in what was known as the Opération Auvergne. This move took everyone by surprise and marked a turning point in the negotiations because it showed everyone the possible consequences of the partition. The images that you see behind me are coming from British Pâté. Let me just be clear, at the time the French were not thinking of leaving the northern half of Vietnam at all, but the evacuation was kept secret. It was abandoning an important nationalist stronghold which had fought tooth and nail against the DRVs during the previous years. And it took everyone by surprise. And as a result, the evacuation was extremely chaotic, as you can see from these images, because the population had to leave to Hanoi on a very short notice. And it was because of this evacuation that the media coverage in the West changed. If you look at the coverage at the beginning of the operation, the New York Times published a map, as you can see here on June 30th, showing that the war in China was truly complicated and that there was no clear-cut outcome to the conflict. But by the end of this operation, and with those images of civilians having to flee on a very short notice to Hanoi, then the New York Times showed a completely different picture. The New York Times, in its weekend supplement, published 3 maps depicting the situation in 1950, then 1952, and eventually 1954. And when the readers were looking at this map, the message that was conveyed was not that it was a very complicated armed conflict and it was difficult to find a solution. It was conveying a more streamlined story, so using the same color, with a different pattern, of course, but using the same color between communist China and the zones under the control of the DRV. The readers understood that communism was dangerously expanding over North Vietnam, and that, of course, those nationalist Vietnamese needed some support. As Philip Catton has shown, this shift in public opinion was perceived in the US Congress, and that explains why American representatives pushed to include a provision in the ceasefire agreements to allow civilians to join the zone of their choice. And in a sense, the Operation Auvergne that was decided late June 1954, and that didn't mean to give and at a time when the French had no intention to leave the North entirely, was already providing a proof of concept, showing everyone, in fact, what could be the pros and cons of the partition. And it was precisely because their withdrawal was rushed that these nationalists were taken by surprise, and that their evacuation was chaotic, that media representations could present them as a vulnerable people betrayed by a no colonial power and in search for a new partnership. The French Union forces at the time also launched a propaganda campaign during Operation Auvergne, so before the signature of the ceasefire agreement. And when I say the French Union forces, it is important to understand that these are not just the French. It is the French Expeditionary Corps and the Army of the State of Vietnam, which are both under French commandment. Well, back then, the number one concern for the French was to prevent an attack and not just an attack from the DRV, but also an attack from any Vietnamese nationalists which might resent this strategic decision to withdraw from those dioceses. And this is why the psychological warfare activities at the time did not even target soldiers of the DRV, trying to convince them, let's say, to leave their ranks, etc. It was targeting mainly the population within those nationalist zones. And of course, this propaganda tried to convey two different messages. The first one, unsurprisingly, encouraged the population to leave together with those nationalist troops. It was warning them about DRV rule, or it was warning them, as you can see from the leaflet right behind me, about an imminent bombing, taking place within the next 3 hours, and of course destroying the entire infrastructure. But a second and most interesting message was one that was interpreting their departure as a strategic move to continue the fight. And to do so, they used that image of a hand. An open hand meant that the fingers, basically those French Union forces, these units in the French Union forces, would be separated from one another and therefore very weak, whereas a closed fist, regrouping along that corridor between Hanoi and Haiphong, would regroup those units and make them as strong as possible so that they could hit much harder. This idea, it is fascinating to see that this logic, the idea that living is not just living is the promise to fight back. It is fascinating to see that this idea was not crafted after the ceasefire, or even in the south under the Republic of Vietnam. This idea that living is fighting better and back in the future had been crafted when the French wanted to justify their withdrawal from the Red River Delta. Lastly, looking at the French archives also help us replace a context that surrounded the evacuation from the north. After the ceasefire was signed, the French had the responsibility to meet certain cutoff dates, of course. They had to surrender Hanoi within 80 days, Haiphong within 100 days, and Haiphong within 300 days. They were also responsible for transporting the civil servants, the soldiers of the state of Vietnam, as well as their family members. However, the evacuation proved to be a lot more chaotic. Why? Because back then, after the ceasefire was signed, and after the French knew they had to leave the north entirely, their number one priority, right after protecting themselves and making sure they were not attacked by anyone, was to dismantle and retrieve and transport as much material and equipment as possible. And this meant literally taking the city apart, removing anything they could from the telecommunication poles, railway equipment, and even the equipment that was used for dikes, wells, irrigation systems, and so on. And this had two consequences. First, the French had to rely on American assistance, which was back then provided by the 7th Fleet, which was patrolling in the area. And many family members of troops and civil servants, which were initially supposed to be transported by the French, were eventually transported by the Americans. And this meant for the population being separated sometimes. The other consequence came from the reaction to that strategy of taking apart most of the equipment. The French faced violent demonstrations from the local population. Some of them were perhaps directed by Viet Minh cadre, but others might have been very well spontaneous, to the point that they had to deploy the military police. As you can see from the photographs, the big one right behind me, you can see the military police that is not actively restraining the population, while at the back another unit is destroying the equipment. The one on the far side over there is showing already a bit more violent action. But so just that we understand that it is again a very tense moment for the French, who are then fearing who actually are giving more reasons for the population to attack them. And because the French are so stressed and so nervous about the population turning against them, they also impose very stringent curfews and limitations to population movements. And as a result, moving from one point to another during that time period was particularly difficult. Of course, not only because of the restriction which had been imposed by the local authorities in the DRV zones, but also by the French military themselves in the nationalist zone. So in conclusion, this short presentation, in this short presentation, I tried to reiterate the importance of understanding the evacuation, not only from the perspective of the Cold War, but also from the perspective of the First Indochina War, that decolonization process, the collapse of the French Empire, and those concerns of the French military command at the time. Thank you very much for listening, and if you'd like to know more about this research and its main finding, please check out the book, which is coming out this December with Cornell University Press.
Wow.